Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. This video is the first part in a series. I have been sitting down with David Larkins, who is the line editor for Pendragon, and we have been talking about the new edition of Pendragon, which is going to be releasing relatively soon. This series is going to go all the way up to the actual release of the Pendragon book, and David and I are going to talk about a ton of the different interesting things that are going to be included in the new edition. The first episode, this one, is about medieval fantasy. So it kind of goes into what is different about Pendragon from a tonal perspective and how it sits apart from some other classic medieval or fantasy TTRPGs. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think the term medieval fantasy has been somewhat misapplied or maybe just overused. People see swords and they see castles and they just say, oh, it's medieval fantasy. But to me, medieval fantasy denotes something much more specific than that. High fantasy honestly has like a lot of other elements that get mixed in, including modern perceptions of what like a pre-industrial world might have been like. So for example, your classic tavern, the tavern that shows up in every D&D campaign, and you know it's almost a cliche, right? Well, that kind of tavern didn't really appear until like the early modern era, 17th century, right? So if you're kind of aiming for a stronger medieval feel, you're not going to have that in your game. You're going to have a strong centralized church, for example. You're going to have conflicts between that church and feudal lords. You're going to just have a sort of a different tone overall.
Let me ask you a little bit of a history question then. I know that medieval itself as a term is kind of contentious, right? It doesn't really have a fixed period.
Sure, absolutely. In academia, there's always an ongoing conversation about how to label things, how to like sort of break up your different periods. In relatively recent discourse, movement has been to go away from the term Dark Ages and to talk more about like late antiquity, and then late antiquity kind of bleeding over into what we would call medieval periods. One of my sort of little pet peeves also is, I completely support this move away from using terms like Dark Ages, because one of my pet peeves, honestly, is this idea that the medieval period, the Middle Ages, was some kind of like dark and like desaturated era, like modern film. Anything that's set in the Middle Ages is like grays and browns and just really grim. And in fact, the Middle Ages, as we understand that term, and we'll just say like 11th to 15th century Europe, right? Very colorful era, actually, as it turns out. People have always loved color, and that applied in the Middle Ages too. And I could go off on a whole side tangent about how our perception of the Middle Ages is really down to later scholars kind of trying to make their own era look better, but that's also kind of what I'm talking about here, is that if you want to evoke medieval fantasy, a feeling of medieval fantasy, it's actually kind of you'll be surprised by what you'll find as you sort of dive into what the Middle Ages were actually like, and that kind of, like I said, tone, that feeling of that era.
You touched on scholars who are trying to sort of depict an older era. You've talked before about how fundamentally Pendragon sort of fits into that because it's the medieval scholars telling a story about a time that came before and applying their values to it.
Absolutely. It's really fascinating, actually, because it's like every era sort of projects its own assumptions onto the past, right? And storytellers in the Middle Ages were just as guilty of that as modern era folk are. But that's part of the fun of Pendragon, honestly, is that you're kind of going through multiple lenses. So it's like our modern values going through the lens of Victorian storytellers who were looking at medieval storytellers, who were looking at actual history from centuries before their time. It's pretty fascinating, honestly, but that's again, why I like to make that differentiation, because we talked before about like sort of genre fantasy versus a more generic fantasy, and medieval fantasy very much in that genre fantasy wheelhouse, right? Where it's kind of like a very specific feeling, generic fantasy kind of being more of a kitchen sink approach.
So, what are the tropes of medieval fantasy, as you understand?
You're looking at first of all, a feudalistic system, right? So you've got kings and queens and dukes, barons, lords. You've got a church or some kind of central, sort of spiritual authority that's sort of in a separate column. And there's power conflicts between those two systems, right? And then under everything, you've got, the commoner class, the peasant class, kind of upholding everyone, and this emergent mercantile or middle class coming out in the cities. So, when you're doing your world building, you're going to have relatively small cities, few thousand people inhabiting these cities. You're going to have an emphasis on sort of bucolic country life, there's going to be a lot of concern about like where you're fitting in this order, opposed to being these sort of like freewheeling adventurers who can just kind of go anywhere they want. You're still going to have adventures, but it's going to be within this larger system. Also, usually you'll have some kind of sense of a previous glory, golden era that has since been lost, but that you're also a part of. The point is often made, we talked about the Byzantine Empire, they called themselves Romans. As far as they were concerned, the Roman Empire never ended. At least until 1453, but from their perspective, they were just continuing the legacy of the Roman Empire. So that's also another interesting thing. I mean, especially if you're setting your game in actual like European medieval history, is where are you setting it? What perspective are you looking at this from? Are you Greek-speaking Romans? Are you Moors in Spain? Are you French nobility squabbling amongst each other? Or are you coming from a more like kind of peasant level thing, like a Robin Hood campaign? Is always a fun way to approach, that kind of medieval history, medieval fantasy.
I've got a two-part question for you next. If you want to dive into medieval fantasy as a GM or as a player, obviously the best step is going to be to pick up the Pendragon book, because it's going to tell you all about it and it's going to guide you through it.
Of course.
So I want to ask about how the new edition of Pendragon is going to enable players and GMs to do that. But I'd also like to ask, before the book's out and also as an accessory, what are some other tools that you can use to get yourself either just into the mindset or, up to date on historical knowledge, or what's your background reading and things like that?
So, like you say, I mean, with Pendragon, we really have always, with this line, have always, tried to present a sort of canned like a idea of like the world. And the thing with Pendragon is that it doesn't pretend to be a realistic simulation. So this, again, medieval fantasy, let's not forget the fantasy part, right? You could run a game that's as close to sort of grounded realism as you can get, but it's fun to include fantastic elements, and those can be things like giants or fairies or whatever. But also, like in Pendragon, knights are the best. They rule the battlefield. No commoner with a longbow is going to cut down a knight on the battlefield. Whereas in medieval history, it's this constant sort of seesawing between knights and things like the longbow or pike blocks or other things that were designed to sort of thwart them on the battlefield. So we're already dealing with this kind of idealized vision. It's like what the knights think of themselves. you can play around. You know, it doesn't have to be this like strict historical simulation, right? You can include these sort of storybook or fairy tale tropes in your medieval fantasy. And in fact, you should if you want to do medieval fantasy. So that being said, I think obviously if you're going for like Arthurian medieval fantasy, then reading some even just like, you know, going back and finding some like kids books from like the golden age of fairy tales and children's books and stuff, or just looking at art from those eras like Howard Pyle, Arthur Rackham, you know, these guys from around the turn of the 20th century who just did these really evocative illustrations for these books. But, you know, if you want to dive into like medieval history just to give yourself an idea, there's some great books out there. World Lit Only by Fire is a good one. A Distant Mirror is one of my favorites. It's history of the 14th century, and it really, you know, it's really pretty eye-opening in terms of challenging some assumptions you might have about like what it was like to live in the Middle Ages, both for knights and peasants and folk from all walks of life. So find some good sort of like popular histories. There's one, actually a more recent one called The Bright Ages, which is very much like a revisionist history. I use that term not pejoratively, right? It's literally like revising our idea of the Middle Ages. And so the authors call it the Bright Ages. It's not the Dark Ages, it's the Bright Ages, you know? And they're very specifically looking at primary sources and sort of looking at like what was life like for folks in, I mean, they start actually in the 5th century, so pretty early on, like late antiquity.
So we've got the new edition of Pendragon, which is going to be coming soon, and we have with it a opportunity for people to dive into medieval fantasy. For somebody who might not have necessarily understood medieval fantasy before watching this video, can you sort of sell it to us in a final way, in an exciting way that talks about all the things that you can do with it?
Sure thing. So I would just encourage folks when they're thinking of medieval fantasy to kind of go beyond the accepted tropes, both of medieval history and of sort of generic fantasy, D&D fantasy, Renaissance fair fantasy, whatever you want to call it, right? And, you know, I think we can talk more in other videos about like specific aspects of medieval fantasy, like, but yeah, like just kind of allow yourself to go on this journey where, you know, some of your preconceived notions are going to be undone, and, you know, you'll just kind of discover the subtle joys of medieval fantasy and how it's differentiated from traditional high fantasy, I think.